You're about to learn something. The doomsaying on climate change that happened yesterday is being undermined by the facts of today, and maybe there's something that we can extrapolate from it for tomorrow. I think this conversation between Jordan Peterson and John Anderson introduces some facts into the debate, especially as it regards the planet's green cover and the food supply chain that has miraculously managed to grow along with our booming populations. Before we explore all of that, I want you to watch this clip that should be a vital reality check to modern environmentalists.
Well, one of the things that, with regards to carbon dioxide output, one of the things that people are listening and watching might want to think about is, I've been attacked many times for being a climate change denier, let's say, and I don't really care for that accusation one way or another. But one of the things I know recently from my investigations is that one of the consequences of carbon dioxide overproduction over the last 15 years, because carbon dioxide levels have been going up, and some of that seems to be a consequence of anthropogenic activity, human industrial activity, let's say, is that paradoxically, and contrary to all predictions on the environmentalist side, the planet is now 15% greener than it was in the year 2000. And 15% that's a tremendous amount. It's an area that's larger than the United States. And it isn't obvious to me that that's a bad thing. And it's more than that. The most remarkable greening has occurred in semi-arid areas. And so the deserts are supposed to expand as the globe warmed or the climate changed, because that was a fait accompli in terms of terminological transformation. And what's happened instead is that that plants have invaded the semi-arid areas to a large degree. And the reason for that is because plants have to breathe through pores. And if they open their pores to get more carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide levels are relatively low, let's say, they let water evaporate out of these pores. If there's more carbon dioxide, they can close their pores. And then it turns out that they can grow where it's drier. And that's driven not only an expansion of greening everywhere there already were plants, but the proliferation of plants into areas that couldn't support them before. And so it's very hard for me to look at that, because that's a huge change, 15%, and not think, well, maybe more plants is a good thing. But there's an additional feature that's going along with that also has to be contended with. And I don't see people on the environmental front grappling with these issues in any manner that strikes me as credible. Not only has the total biomass of plants increased tremendously, 15%, but crop yields have gone up, because it turns out that carbon dioxide is a pretty damn good fertilizer. So instead of having less food because of climate change forced by carbon dioxide, we actually have more food, and we have more food with less fertilizer. And so I think you could make a case, and I know this is utterly heretical, and it might not even be true, that carbon dioxide output's a net good.
Doesn't that show you how quickly science evolves around the matter, calling into question the centuries-long projections you see today on the climate amelioration front? Take, for example, one simple debate that was happening just a few decades ago, which is the increase in desert areas due to carbon dioxide and deforestation. Here was the rather simplistic logical pathway provided by the science of the time. Human population growth was a zero-sum game, and resources were shrinking, and deforestation combined with warmer temperatures was going to lead to increased desert cover on Earth. It's actually interesting when you realize just how similar the language and the doomsaying around desertification was around half a century ago, oddly similar to what you see today. It was a fear expressed with terms like dust bowls to refer to places that were quickly becoming arid and sandy as water and vegetation ran out. Let me read you an excerpt from a book from all the way back in 1977 titled Spreading Deserts, the Hand of Man. It reads, and I quote, "Year after year, additional land is converted to waste by humans who are in many cases forced to compromise their futures by circumstances beyond their control. As a result of the unsound use of land, deserts are creeping outward in Africa, Asia, and Australia, and the Americas. Worst, the productive capacity of dry regions in both rich and poor countries is falling." Doesn't that sound oddly similar to the Malthusian thinking that has enveloped the modern environmentalist movement? Not to mention the fact that it turned out to be false because the scientific literature of the time just couldn't take into account the fact that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could actually help plants and greenery move into more arid areas up to a certain point. And it's not like there were no people poking a hole in these doomsday scenarios at the time as being based in incomplete or inconclusive scientific info. Here's a paper from nearly 4 decades ago questioning the half-baked scientific certainties that were making people at the time sound the alarm over the desertification problem, and it reads, quote, "The problem of desertification has been poorly characterized in several ways by public statements, books, magazines, and sometimes scientific articles. First, the impression has been conveyed that the extent of the problem of desertification is well known, when in fact the evidence is extraordinarily scanty. If anything, what you can take away from this historical perspective is that the alarm bells over climate change and degradation you're seeing right now are nothing new in human history, and humans tend to focus more on what's going wrong, whether real or not, more than what they can do about it."
I also know, for example, that we have somewhere between 300 and 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now. And that's actually it's actually low by historical standards, quite low. And plants really have a hard time even living at 150. So that's the cutoff for plants to breathe. And so a carbon dioxide intensive world is actually a lot more friendly to plants. Now you could say, well, we're still risking catastrophe by changing the biosphere that rapidly, because a 15% increase in plant coverage is nothing trivial, and there may be elements of that are destabilizing in some ways I don't understand. But the prediction that we were going to produce an expansion of desert, for example, and a denuding of a transformation of semi-arid areas into desert, that all seems to be like completely wrong. That did not happen. The opposite happened. And so I don't know what to make of that fact, because as far as I can tell, that fact is incontrovertibly true. And so I don't see that there's a leg for the apocalyptic environmentalists to stand on, especially given that their policies have been counterproductive and they're driving people into poverty. One hypothesis is, the planet has a limited carrying capacity and it's a zero-sum game, and we're Malthusian, rats and overpopulating the place, and that what we need to do in consequence is limit growth and perhaps move towards a much less populated planet. That last one is a very frightening proposition because, as you said,
life-based ethics.
Well, who gets to go? That's the real question, and exactly how.
And who are the monsters who make the decision?
Well, exactly that. But I also think that model, it's certainly not the only model that you can derive from the data, let's say, because one of the things I learned when I was deeply investigating the relationship between economic growth and long-term environmental viability, let's say, sustainability, something like that, was that, strangely enough, and perhaps not so, if you can lift people out of absolute poverty and get them up to something approximating $5,000 a year in terms of average, say, contribution to GDP, then they stop adopting a short-term view and they start to adopt a long-term view because they have the luxury of being able to think beyond the moment. And I suppose partly why we want security, which is what wealth can offer, at least to some degree, is so that we're not bound by the absolute emergencies of the moment.
Absolutely.
We can stretch our minds across a longer span of time.
Couldn't agree with you more.
I think this is a truth that anyone can attest to in their own life. When you're in distress, time seems to shrink and everything that's unimportant falls by the wayside. That's the state that describes the billions of poor people across the world today whose immediate needs are so desperate that the environment is very low on their list of priorities. I remember reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and he made exactly the same observation about human nature, even in the most extreme condition of the concentration camps in World War II. He described this kind of life as merely a provisional existence where nothing else matters but the here and now. That's sadly close to what describes many people in the world. We cannot get people who are in their dire straits, whether physically, emotionally, or financially, to worry about carbon emissions or the environment. Unfortunately, that's what describes a large part of the world today, made worse by the denial of cheap electricity on the basis of utopian environmentalist ideas. to countries that desperately need it to lift their poor people out of poverty. Do you see what this is doing? It's creating a vicious circle that hundreds of millions of people are stuck in today. They can't care about the environment unless they escape their desperate poverty. They can't escape their desperate poverty without using cheap fossil fuel energy, and they can't use cheap energy without inevitably polluting the environment in the short term. The answer of the utopian and Malthusian environmentalists is a silent paralysis.
If you get people up to about $5,000 per year in terms of their ability to generate income, then they start to be concerned about the environment. But the environmental concerns start to be expressed in a way that's, I would say, truly sustainable, because you could imagine that we could take a top-down approach to environmental planning, but top-down solutions have the problem of, first of all, being unitary, and second of all, so they can go catastrophically wrong if they're wrong. They're also difficult to impose. But if you make enough people, if you free enough people from absolute poverty, they start to be concerned about environmental maintenance locally. And so what you get is a distributed attempt across the world of people to improve the quality of their local environment. So that's maybe hundreds of millions of people that have a longer term viewpoint instead of a few centralist utopians trying to govern the whole planet. And that's a much more stable solution. So we should be doing everything we can to lift the world's absolute poor out of their absolute poverty. And we do that. So then we can say, well, how do we do that? And one of the ways we do that is by moving towards the provision of free and ample energy. That's a crucial issue.
That's how we fed 5 billion extra people over the last 45 years.
And so that means we have to give some serious consideration to intelligent use of fossil fuels, which we're doing anyways.
It's unfortunate, but it's hard to think that this will be made possible in the near future. The modern environmentalist movement has made a dreadful mistake in that it is construing the question as a balancing act between the climate change fight and lifting up the poor. In reality, it shouldn't even be a balancing act in the first place. If nothing else, there's just one thing that should make this decision absolutely easy. The goals around the environment or carbon mitigation front being given to us are hazy, undefined, and hard to measure, but the pain and desperation of hundreds of millions of poor fellow humans is the most real thing there is. That alone should jolt anyone out of the utopian visions being sold to us, the likes of which we've seen before. Jordan Peterson is a vital force in making that happen, and I'm glad that we can get to hear a dissenting voice like him in this contentious modern debate.